afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Mullen, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you all to today's program, What is the Role of the Librarian in an Open Access World?, sponsored by SAGE and featuring a panel discussing open access from the perspectives of the librarian, the publisher, and the researcher. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the left-hand side, you will also see a Q&A panel that you can use to submit questions or comments. We will spend some time responding to your questions during the program, so please feel free to submit these throughout. And finally, please note that today's program will be recorded and all registrants will receive follow-up instructions on how to access the archived version. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel for today. Chuck Ekman, University Librarian and Dean of Library Services at Simon Fraser University, represents the librarian's perspective. Giving the publisher's perspective is Dave Ross, Executive Publisher of OA at SAGE. And providing the researcher's perspective is Michael S. Mott of the University of Mississippi Advanced Education Center. And now I'd like to get us started by turning things over to Chuck Ekman. Chuck?
Thanks very much, Laura, and greetings, everyone. So I'm providing both a brief overview of open access as well as the librarian's perspective, and I'll get started with the overview. The first issue is why open access. There are a number of vectors driving open access, and each has its set of stakeholders. I'm highlighting just four for this presentation. First, from the librarians and university administrators' perspectives, sustainable scholarly communication is a critical value. Various studies highlight the growth of global research outputs, roughly on the order of 2 to 4% each year, and we know our collections budgets aren't able to keep pace. By sustainable, I mean creating effective means for controlling the overall cost of scholarly communications as the scope of content expands and diversifies in terms of the variety of content. I don't necessarily mean reducing allocations or spending on collections. The second vector here is government and private funders worldwide are interested in ensuring that the results of externally funded research are made available without barriers to readers as quickly as possible, both in order to demonstrate the value of their funding programs, but more importantly to accelerate research itself by expanding the global knowledge base for problem solving. A third vector is that researchers, as well as the home institutions for the researchers, are interested in promoting the impact of their research. And they recognize that the readership of open content creates an opportunity for impact that doesn't exist for told content. And finally, and I'm using John Walensky's The Access Principle, published in 2006 as an exemplar here, there is a sui generis value for openness and scholarly communications in terms of positive social, civic, and economic impacts. So there are a variety of flavors, or in this case, colors for open access. I'll quickly run through the next 3 slides because I think the audience here is very familiar with this landscape, but just to set the stage. First, gold open access refers to journals, books, and articles that are published as open access following a peer review process. This includes open access journals as well as articles written in traditional subscription or toll access journals that have been made open upon a publication, typically through payment of a publication fee. This subset of individual articles published in subscription journals is often referred to as hybrid OA. We are witnessing a rapid growth in this general category of gold open access, particularly because several subscription journals have a delayed OA practice that moves content from closed to open after a specific time frame. Some of the estimates of the scale of this growth are listed here on the slide. The second category, green open access, refers to submission, publication of an article either as a pre or post-print by the author through an institutional or subject repository. The article will have been published elsewhere, typically in a subscription journal. Bjork's 2009 study identified that the scope of scientific content available via green open access ranged from a low of 6% in biochemistry to a high of 30% in earth sciences. Finally, and with no color designation, I've created the other open access category, which covers a whole range of open content, faculty websites, open digital collections, data sets, open educational resources, etc. In terms of business models for open access, I want to emphasize costs don't go away due to open access. Various business strategies have been developed to cover the costs of publishing open access. Publication charges, memberships, and advertising are just three among those approaches. Fund flows are increasingly being supported by author funds at both the institutional level and at the funder level. There's a lot of innovation going on in this domain. Third-party solutions are emerging to help facilitate these flows, as well as examples of support for these costs in consortial licensing. We're seeing disciplinary-based initiatives such as the Scope 3 initiative for particle physics and the Episciences initiative for mathematics. Other experiments include the PureJ and eLife approaches. And it's important to emphasize this is not just journals. Knowledge Unlatched is a recent initiative supporting open access monograph publishing. But there's much more going on. And this is a very brief final note that I think the audience is aware of. There are issues involving rights in open access. It doesn't end with closed access. Peter Suber has identified two major flavors of open access: gratis open access, which is essentially content free to read; Libre, which is content free to read and reuse in different ways. The latter, the Libre open access, is more flexible in allowing reuse, for example, data mining and course pack use, and understanding the difference between these two is important when evaluating the relative openness of journals. So that's my general introduction to OA, and I'll move now into the librarian perspective. There's the face again. Let's see, support OA. So why libraries? Well, if we go back to the four vectors driving OA that I outlined in the first slide, we can track a library interest as well as a role. In terms of sustainable scholarly communication, our interest is clear. We are stewards of the university's largest knowledge budgets, basically the library collections budget. In terms of accelerating research, libraries have always viewed the objective of our support for collections as self-evident and a reaction to supporting the knowledge consumption needs of researchers and students. In an increasingly open access environment where OA may soon represent 60% of the global knowledge environment, libraries need to demonstrate their value, and this provides a way for doing that. Linking to the researcher recognition factor, the library's client-centered approach, as well as our expertise in the broad domain around indexing, bibliography, and bibliometric analysis, positions us well to provide interesting support roles in this arena. And I would say that finally, with regard to the social and civic impacts, libraries have significant histories of community engagement and support. Our academic library collections have often been made available to members of the community for the cost of an external borrower's library card. As licensed online content has grown in importance to our researchers, this level of community access has been in many ways undermined. We have strived to balance this phenomenon by ensuring as much as possible that our licenses ensure on-site access at our public computer workstations, but the community, including the alumni of our institutions, view this as substantially second-class access to that which we provide for our students and faculty. Open access can help us recreate that earlier era of demonstrable value of academic libraries, both to our primary communities and to our surrounding communities. In the next few moments, I will outline some ways that libraries can support open access in tangible fashion, using as an example some of the programs of the Simon Fraser University Library. But this is not meant to be exhaustive. There are myriad of ways underway at libraries, including those represented in this call, during this period of rapid change and innovation, of experimentation with open access support. So I'll talk a little bit here about the Gold OA phenomenon and how libraries can support, and there are really two fundamental aspects of that support to my mind that immediately appear. The first is to support equity for our researchers who wish to publish in open access venues. The notion of publishing equity was outlined by Stuart Schieber at Harvard in a 2008 article. His engagement led to the establishment of the Compact on Open Access Publishing Equity. Institutions who are members of COPE commit to establishing an open access fund to subsidize publication charges for OA. Simon Fraser University's fund has supported nearly 100 articles published in this manner since its inception in 2010. The second role for libraries is to provide publishing services. Many large libraries are now operating university presses or providing significant publishing infrastructure to support journal and book publishing at their institution. The Library Publishing Coalition is a new organization that recognizes and promotes these activities. And they've just this week published the first directory of library-based publishing operations. There are 115 entries in their publishing directory. Whether or not your library hosts a press, it can offer services. For example, Simon Fraser doesn't have an institutional press. However, the SFU library offers advice on journal setup and free journal hosting services to its faculty and students. I also want to note here that Spark has provided excellent websites to serve as supports to individual libraries and librarians who are beginning to think about and planning to set up OA funds or publishing programs. In terms of green OA, there are no surprises here. Libraries are generally quite active in this arena. We've been building institutional repositories, trying to solicit and build the content in those repositories, working to improve their vitality in various ways. We're negotiating positive terms for licensed content, specifically enabling faculty to retain their rights and including the right to include articles publishing in course packs and post them on their websites and in the OA repositories. Libraries are providing copyright advice to institutional authors, and this is a point I want to draw out, that we should be, wherever possible, linking green and gold OA at our institutional levels. At SFU and at other institutions that are supporting OA publishing, we're linking, and they are the articles that we subsidize to our institutional repository in various ways to steward that content. Let's see. So, oops, jumped too fast. Beyond gold and green, this is the other category without the color. So I just wanted to touch on this. OA is more than books and journals. Faculty websites, we know we need to watch and whenever possible promote to our faculty the values of the institutional repositories that we're hosting, or subject repositories as well, in terms of ensuring long-term preservation and access to the content that the faculty are posting to their own websites. Digitized collections, there's huge potential here to provide open access to the legacy content in our library collections, as well as content that the faculty and students at our institutions produce. At SFU, we manage a scholarly digitization fund that for the past 3 years has enabled funding for digitization of 8 to 10 collections each year, so close to 30 at this point. These are collections that are either part of our library, special collections, or in the faculty's own collections, research collections. The one condition that we set for this process, well, there are several. There's copyright clearance is necessary, but the condition is that the resulting digital product is openly accessible. There are other areas for growth here. Data sets are the new frontier. Much is underway. There's a strong and open movement in this area that is being promoted by some of the new funder and government mandates. But that's probably a topic for another webinar along with open educational resources. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn this over to the researcher's perspective, which will be presented today by Dr. Michael Mott at the University of Mississippi's Advanced Education Center. Michael.
Thank you, Charles. And I'd like to thank everyone for being interested in this topic. It has greatly benefited me. I'll give you a quick synopsis of my experience with SAGE. I am an educational researcher specializing in literacy and lighting and literacy issues in general. And I've published in traditional journals, written books, chapters, and other traditional formats. 2 years ago, our team had the opportunity to study a new lighting technology in collaboration with Philips Philips Corporation, based in the Netherlands. And we examined their lighting technology and the effect it had on reading achievement, which in the United States is a very important area where we're falling behind. Philips, by the way, had 3 teams, one in the Far East, one in Europe, and we were the USA team. And we conducted our research, and we thought, where should we publish this? And we made a fortunate decision, which was to publish it with SAGE, because what happened was we had a really good experience with the editing, and it turned out to be a great product. And what happened is, due to the open access of all the stuff that I've written, and my colleagues and I talk about this all the time, we get phone calls, emails, information requests from all over the world, as opposed to some other really good research we did that is buried away in traditional journals that, and I guess, and I'm not a technologist, but I'm just going to go on a limb and say that people Google things today. And I know librarians may, we have our search engines for journals and things like that, but people Google things, and when you Google lighting and learning, and maybe our next speaker, David Ross, will be able to explain, and I don't want to put him on the spot, but SAGE has done something where we're Google optimized, because those 2 keywords get us pretty high up at the top. And I will say that we've published 3 articles through SAGE, and all of them have many hits, much more than our traditional published formatted articles. The research is not necessarily, it's peer-reviewed, so it had to meet those criteria, but it's not necessarily better than other things we've done. But what is much better is the open access and the fact that people can quickly find our information and ask us about it. We have published 3 articles, excuse me, and the lighting, illuminating the effects of dynamic lighting was the first article I mentioned. Our first one was actually technical examination of a measure of phonological sensitivity. And that effort created a statewide initiative in Mississippi, here in the United States, to look at phonological awareness as a readiness skill for phonics achievement, a very important thing in a state that is 44th out of 50 in reading. Our third article, What's Going On During Vocabulary Lessons, is an open-ended, qualitative research investigation looking at how teachers are to consider quality of vocabulary instruction, a very neglected area in the research. I will say that I have been very pleased as a professor that sometimes engages in research that is specialized and has a small audience. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to have the whole world be able to look at my work. I've never had that before. And my co-author, Dr. Daniel H. Robinson, who is the Dean, Director of School of Education at Colorado State University, and the editor of the Journal of Experimental Psychology, indicated that he is equally pleased that this is really the way to go when you are trying to disseminate important results and to get it into the right hands. In the case of our lighting article, the right hands are lighting engineers, designers, architects, school administrators, teachers, and any constituents that want to improve the educational environment to affect outcomes. I will say that this has been a really good experience from a nuts and bolts standpoint. The editing process was extremely professional. So for those librarians that would recommend to scholars where to publish, excuse me, I would say SAGE would be great from that standpoint. I have full confidence in the final product as they stand today in my 3 articles. I will now segue into, I will now refer to David Ross of SAGE, and I thank you for listening. I apologize for my voice, just getting off of a cold here, but I'm very pleased to present to you. And David, you're up right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the kind words about SAGE, and yeah, I'm obviously delighted you had a good experience with us. On your particular point about how we go around, we actually make your put you high up the Google rankings. I can't answer your question on that one because I'm not a techie. All I do know is that we commit an enormous amount of resources to what we call search engine optimization, and I'm delighted that it actually has an effect. So I'm here, as Laura said at the beginning, to provide a publisher's perspective. And I'd just like to start off, I mean, obviously I'm going to talk about this as a publisher from SAGE, but, you know, publishers are not all one thing. I think the last count, there's 10,000 publishers of scholarly journals out there. Now, obviously, there's an enormously long tail of individual scholar-run journals, but even that said, even the quite large head of this, does encompass enormous amounts of different organisations covering different material. So bear that in mind when you think of a publisher and its experiences with open access specifically. Also, just from a SAGE perspective, I mean, what are we publishing? We're many things. We're a publisher of 700 journals, HSS and STM. We're also a publisher of an enormous amount of books in the social sciences, but we're the publisher of over 300 learner societies and associations, and I'm sure we're all aware that many of those societies and associations rely on their publishing income to continue to do the good work they do in their community. So we have to have their interests very much in mind. And also, from an open access point of view, we're predominantly humanities and social science publisher, and that has provided some very specific challenges as we've tried to kind of extend open access into social sciences. You know, I think everyone is aware that open access developed out of the biomedical life sciences. Funding is a very different, there's a very different funding situation in those areas. There's multi-million-pound research grants and a lot more resources available to fund open access. That's not there in social science. So we've kind of, even as the one publisher, we straddle very many different stakeholders' points of view. From all that said, you know, I think these areas of impact probably are relevant to most of the larger traditional subscription publishers. The biggest change we've seen is that, you know, historically we have been set up to transact with libraries, and your librarians have been until now our main customers. That hasn't changed. We no longer transact with libraries, but this has introduced a whole new system where we need to interact directly with the authors. And indeed, that is one of the kind of benefits that many of the proponents of open access put out there, is that it actually introduces a functionality into the market, because we're kind of transacting directly with the author at the point of payment, although that's not strictly true when we start moving into institutional funds and, you know, sort of prepaid discounting deals that a lot of libraries are entering into. It's had enormous impact on our business from a systems and processes point of view. You know, the obvious, in that we've got to set up to interact directly with the author in a way we didn't before, but there's big processing implications. I as the open access point person, if you like, within Sage globally, say I would spend about 50% of my time dealing with back office systems and processes. There's an enormous lot of support work goes in. And again, it's because we're setting up these systems in parallel. It's not as if one part of our business has gone away. There's a whole other part of our business that's now expanding, and that presents its own very different challenges. The last main point of impact, I mean, obviously, because I spent 50% of my time dealing with the system side of it, I could talk about it at length, but I just wanted to bring out the licensing point, because I think that's having a huge effect on both the way scholarly communication is done and the way that we as publishers handle it. Because, you know, the heart, I think Charles pointed out, you know, Peter Suber's definition of open access is as the Libra one, where it's about reuse as well. And if you go back to the Berlin Declaration, which is kind of where open access is defined, it is enshrined in that open access is as much about allowing or enabling reuse of material as it is about it being free to read with no barriers to access. So that has a myriad knock-on effects to what we see as our traditional role is, both in terms of defending authors' third-party rights downstream, and then again, from the systems point of view, we feel, actually, as Sage has taken a decision that we shouldn't be imposing a license upon anyone. It will be a Creative Commons license, because again, that is what open access requires, but there's 6 different kinds of Creative Commons licenses. And I'm not going to bore the audience with going through them now, but we've decided to enable author choice in that as much as we can. So we need to now be all of a sudden set up to handle 6 different kinds of licenses, and that has contracts implications and rights implications, downstream use, but also obviously systems implications for displaying what license an article is published under, let alone enabling the author choice in the first place. So that to me, I think is very it's a fundamental point of open access, and it's a very good example of the kind of knock-on effects it's having on our business. So, I'm not going to go on at length here. In a sense, I'm here as a publisher as much to sort of answer any questions you, as the community, have about publishing. But I will wrap up. All that said before about having to now interact directly with the author, we do still believe that well into the future, the library will be our main partner in all of this. I mean, again, it's already happening with institutional funds, like the Compact initiative that Charles was referring to, in prepaid deals. Our salespeople are going to be talking to librarians as they're out on the road, and the same way they talk about all our other offerings. We've discovered that, well, the all things in life really, engage us the way forward. Let's keep talking to one another. This is not straightforward for us. It's, subscription publishers are going through a big transition as a result of all this. It's a parallel system at the moment, but it is going to more and more tip towards open access. It will develop in unexpected ways. I've been involved in open access for 6 or 7 years actively with Sage, and there's been an enormous transformation in the market in that time. And I dare say that there were a lot of people who hadn't even heard of the concept back then. And then what next? I think open data, as mentioned by Charles, it is the big next vanguard of the open movement. But at the humanities end of the spectrum, what about books? What about monographs? How are we going to handle those? Does a monograph become a short for a long-form research article, or vice versa? So that's, I think people are really trying to figure out, we're certainly spending a lot of time trying to figure out how we could make this model work somehow, the monograph publishing, because I think we all know that the difficulties that particular product has. And finally, I'd just like to point you with this, it's great to be involved in this webinar, but it's something that we've been kind of involved in quite closely in the UK for quite some time. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the Research Council UK issued a mandate back in April, which is a very strong gold open access mandate, which has focused the minds of a lot of There was actually, we held a round table with a bunch of them back in September, and there's a link there at the bottom, which really was, it's a summary of that round table of implementing open access APCs, the role of the libraries, again, the UK focused. But just to give you a presto, which may lead on to the conversation, the main focus of that, or the main thing that came out of that, was the allocation of article processing charge money. The institutional funds is their big problem. How you actually manage those funds is not straightforward. How you actually decide who gets them is even more complicated because you're involved in the actual research process. And yeah, for the future, it was the effects on subscription pricing, the effects of the monograph market, and open data, and some quality concerns as well. So thank you for listening to that. I will now just, I think, hand it back and open it up to questions. So the first question that's come up here has been directed towards me. And the question is, what are the trends regarding who pays for the open access costs when publishing in traditional journals, libraries or researchers? That's an interesting question. I mean, I think the answer is it depends right at the moment. If you're talking about the biomedical end of the market, I still think the main it's mainly the academic themselves. They are allowed to build it into their research grants, and so they pass that on. But when you come to the social sciences, then they don't have research grants in the same way, and so what we're finding is we're directing with the libraries, and they're actually setting up, there's the big multi-institutional compacts, and there's also institutional funds within the libraries, and we're spending a lot of time talking to libraries. So again, it varies on which discipline you're in. I think on balance, as in answer to the trend is still the researcher appears to bears the cost mainly. I don't know if you have a view on that, Chuck.
Well, I agree with that, but I would say that I think that the creation of these open access funds and the concept of publishing equity that Stuart Cheever has promoted really is driving the creation of those funds to within the institutions at least create an opportunity for subsidy for those faculty who don't have access to a major research grant to cover those publication costs. So at the two institutions I worked at that have had these funds, we've really made, and I think this is generally the case, we've inquired with each application to use the fund from a faculty member whether they have access to those publication funds. If they do, we ask that they use that grant to cover the cost so that we can preserve it for those who don't have access to those funds. The other aspect is that there are really widely differing costs for those publication charges depending on the discipline. So the same amount of money can go actually a lot farther within the HSS or Humanities Social Sciences research journals than it can in the biomedical or STM literature, open access literature. Okay, I see another question. This one for me. Could I talk a bit more about linking green and gold OA? What I had in mind when I was putting that on the PowerPoint really is a larger question about shifting roles of librarians from acquirers of externally published information to gatherers and custodians of institutional outputs, becoming more like archivists for locally produced research. And also that we've had in the OA advocacy community a lot of focused energy around defining the path forward. And it's usually posed in discussions. I guess the most recent public discussion is the Finch report and its follow-ups. Green versus gold publishing. And what I was hoping to do with it was to treat both of the phenomena as facts of life in the current scholarly communications landscape. And not focusing on them as bad or good. And I think that if you look at it that way, and what we're doing at the institutional levels, we want to be growing our relationships with our research officers, with our external relations officers, offices, press and media relations departments, looking at academic departments, making connections there. And we need to be linking our institutional repositories to our institutional agendas. Efforts around creating expertise database, exposing the research produced by the institution. And in all of this, we need to be thinking about looking at the green and gold open access outputs from a really agnostic perspective, that we need to be as comprehensive as possible, but that will force some thinking about the relationship of the two types of publications when we build our repositories, when we link them to institutional expertise databases, to faculty bibliographies online, all of that. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I had in mind.
And I would just add to that, I think, what's come out of the OSTP recently about their directive that all funding agencies, over $100 million, I believe it is, need to put forward a plan of how their material can be made in a repository. The material that comes out of that, those grants can be made available in a repository. It is going to escalate this whole issue of green open access, because once every US researcher that's funded by a major grant giver is going to have to do this, it's going to mean a lot more of the world's material is made available in some green form, and yeah, that has big implications. The next question that's come up has been directed to me too. What business model or thinking was Sage engaged when it set up Sage Open, i.e. what does Sage get out of it? That's an interesting question, particularly this latter half of it. Sage gets out of it that, we are continued to be involved in the development of the scholarly communication market, to put it quite simply. I mean, I'd like to think Sage is in a fairly unique position in that we are an independent organisation, still wholly owned by our founder and chairperson, Sarah Miller-McCune. and Sage has actually been set up that the company will pass into a charitable trust at some point when Sarah passes on. And that basically allows us to take a long-term view. We're not dependent or beholden to short-term shareholder interest, so it allows us to take a longer-term view. I'm guessing the root of the question is really that in social sciences, where there is no, the open access business model is a gold paid-for APC model, and in the social sciences, there isn't the money available there for APCs, which led to the inevitable question of how is it ever going to work in social science. A lot of people spend a lot of time at Sage, discussing this, debating it, and we said the only way to find out is to give it a go and actually see if there's an appetite for this and see how best to develop it forward. So we see it as contributing to the ongoing development of the market. We currently try to use different price points. It's currently highly discounted $99 because we believe the main thing was trying to get some content in there. But no, I don't think anyone's denying that will have to go up at some point. That's not an economically viable level. But yeah, I hope that answers the question of whoever posed it. It'll be interesting to know if they'd like to follow up on any of that. Okay, next question to come up for me and Michael, that's Dave and Michael, and I'm going to hand over to, the question is the peer review process for open access articles as robust as it is for traditional subscription-based journals? I'm going to hand over to Michael on this because he's, in a sense, the independent, objective person who's gone through the process. I would just say, yes, in a simple answer. I think there's no reason why it shouldn't be as robust. I think, in fact, because of the spotlight on the kind of ethical issues, that open access probably needs to be held to a slightly higher standard of peer review than subscription journals at the moment as it establishes itself. But the proof is in the pudding, as they say. So over to Michael and his experiences of it.
Absolutely, I would say it is as robust or more. I think my experience with traditional peer review journal process is that there can take place sort of a clubby atmosphere, and I think the open format with blind peer review from Sage really takes that away. We've encountered so many things when we write. If you don't cite an individual that needed to be cited who was reviewing your article, because you didn't feel that they fit in there, that could be a cause for not being published. So there's all kinds of sort of things that go on in very established peer review journal environments, and I think that the Sage Open really took that away. It was really about the intellectual property itself. And I think that's really important because, if knowledge gets so specialized that through personal idiosyncrasies, folks don't accept your article, and that's happened to our team, I think that sort of gets in the way of really important information getting out to the public. And in an open journal format, the public really can decide, and not just the reviewers. So is it, long answer short, it is very robust, and it is the most robust process in terms of the back end and how the public perceives your research.
I see the next question is for Chuck. Sorry about that. Let's see the question, I'll read it. I am just starting to see the possible value of managing an institutional repository for our institution, but the project seems overwhelming. Where would a small institution start? Just let me, self-disclosure, I'm not an institutional repository expert, nor am I an IT person. There are a number of commercial and open access software options out there for managing such an IR. There are hardware and maintenance issues that would need to be addressed. In British Columbia, here, a number of institutions at the medium to small level are banding together and talking about a consortial approach to supporting IRs that might have a common infrastructure but be branded separately at the institutional level. And I think probably my thoughts would be to look at how you can band together with others who are in similar situations and looking to the future, because once you've set something up like this, you can't assume that it's going to be a small project. The likelihood based on the trends out there is that it's going to continue to grow.
The next question, I think, is for Chuck and me, although I can't actually read it now because someone's hidden it up. There we go. No one thinks the library's buyer's role is declining, just that it flips to OA materials more than traditional acquisitions. Is that right? This is directed to both me and you, Chuck, as a librarian, but I'll make an attempt at it first. No, I don't think it's declining. I think it's more, it depends on your view of the world, really. We see what's happening is two very parallel systems are developing. And whilst they are obviously interrelated because they're both dealing with the publication of primary research articles, how they are administered is very different. I think there was a presumption when the open access movement, and I'll call it a movement because there is a lot of ideology out there, so when that started, that this was going to be the role of the librarian in terms of managing scholarly research material, primary research material, was going to decline. But what we've seen is quite the opposite. We are, for example, although we don't sell librarians our open access titles, we are now putting them into our packages because the feedback we got from the library community was that they needed them and the metadata in them to set them up in their electronic catalogue so that their readers could find them. So that makes no difference in the way we package our stuff to them. And I just think generally, again, because, apart from the high-end sort of biomedical market where there's lots of money, that somehow institutional funds are going to have to come into play if this is actually going to become any sizable portion of the research output, then the obvious person to administer them is the librarian. Not only because you've been the one historically set up to work with the publishers, but also because, as in terms of your faculty outreach role, this is a natural part of that. But I'm going to pass over to Charles now and see if he agrees with that.
Yes, I agree with that, and I agree with the questioner. It's just the nature of what is being purchased that is evolving. In one case, there's a continued role of purchasing content that's available uniquely to members of that institution. That's for the continuity of closed access, and as well as for books, tangible objects. But there is increasing the purchasing of the right to publish an article on the publisher's website as an open access item. So the purchase, it's just the target of the purchase is slightly different, and I think it's really important to keep the notion of those two purchasing processes unified. This is something that enables sort of efficiencies across the landscape from the institutional's perspective, what is going on in the scholarly communications domain. And I think libraries have a great role as managing collections. They look across the institution. They have practices around managing different disciplinary needs with regard to use of that collections budget, balancing different interests across campus, ensuring that there's equity for access to content that's appropriate. And I think the same values apply in looking at applying those funds to support open access publishing across the institution's office. And I see the next question is also for Chuck. Do you have an OA? Okay, so no, Simon Fraser University does not have an open access mandate or an open access policy. And one thing I didn't mention is that many institutions, they do have either at selected faculty levels or institution-wide an open access policy. And I think this is going to be a growing phenomenon in response to some of the vectors out there. And I should mention that there is the Coalition of Open Access Policy Institutions now numbers 50 institutions in North America that represents those institutions with such an open access policy. That's an important phenomenon. Oh, and another question for Chuck. Could you discuss Simon Fraser's role in hosting journals being published in your campus? So Simon Fraser does not have a press, but the library is actually, and has been for the last 8 years, the administrative host for the Public Knowledge Project, which maintains and develops the Open Journal System software, Open Conference System software, and the new Open Monograph Press software. And a couple of years ago, there was a discussion that we also host journals on a cost recovery basis for institutions globally. That is, we provide the behind-the-scenes support on servers and access. We do that for both universities and selected commercial publishers. So one of the discussions we had in the library was, shouldn't we be thinking about, as long as Simon Fraser University doesn't have a press, could we find a way to leverage what we're doing with Public Knowledge Project and software and journal hosting to support our user community. So what we do is we provide free services and free journal hosting for our faculty and students and researchers who are editors for journals or who want to start up a journal. That kind of thing is what's going on. And we provide advice, and we're doing that with monographs as well now.
Hi, I'm not sure if Michael's still on the line anymore, but if he is, there's a question for you here. Who funded your SAGE Open submission? Who paid your APC? Are you willing to share that information?
Sure. Yeah, I think that I'm in the field of education, and typically we have not had to come up with funds to publish, and probably the viewpoint would be that in a peer review process there should be no funds exchanged. But really, I think it's changed, the perception has changed, as the School of Engineering at the University of Mississippi and the School of Pharmacy, they tend to have peer-reviewed articles where they have had to pay a certain fee as part of the publishing process. So all of my articles were paid for by the graduate school, which didn't blink in paying. Once they heard that it was peer-reviewed, they paid the nominal fee, and I forget what it was. I think it varies. But no, that's really not a problem. I think that professors may have a problem if they had to pay out of their pocket, but typically it seems that we don't.
Yeah, and I did from my publisher's point of view, to Dave here, I'd kind of that's our experience too, that even, you know, at the $99 level for Sage Open, which said is kind of an introductory rate, even then we're seeing, whilst a lot of people are paying out of their own pockets, most people aren't. It's still coming from a fund of some kind. And from our interactions in libraries, when you talked about how they allocate, there's very much at the moment, it's kind of a bit of a first come, first served scenario. The next question that's up is a big one, and we could, with even 5 minutes left, we couldn't cover all this, but it is a few recent articles in the Scholarly Kitchen blog have been attempting to formulate a prediction that green OA self-archiving will result in libraries cancelling subscriptions, according to the why pay for what you can get for free logic. Thoughts on this? It's directed at both Chuck and me, but I'll go first and just say thoughts on this really are, yeah, it's sort of predicting the future, but you can see there's a clear tipping point when, you know, the subscription journals that verify the material, that enable it to be published and then the green authors version to be made available, if people cancel them, then that entire system breaks down. So it's hard to see how the journal business, as in the business that performs peer review, will continue if they're all cancellations. There's a bit of a disconnect there. Also, you know, my main answer, simple answer to what is a very complicated question is, I don't think the world is that straightforward. I don't think that you might see some libraries cancelling because some part of their journal is made available open access, but my prediction is that there's going to be a mixed economy that's going to exist for quite some time. And yeah, when critical mass of material is available and that is discoverable in the green repositories, that may have a knock-on effect. I would just put one point out there, is that the only field that has had green open access almost entirely, the entire publishing output, is physics. And that's all been freely available in a green model through archives since the early 1990s. And physics subscription journals have seen no further higher attrition than any other field. So what does that say? The only logical explanation I've ever heard from that is that what librarians are paying for is the version of record, is the back file, is the discoverability, and that's what they provide to their patrons. But that's the one live example we've got, and it hasn't had any effect on subscriptions.
I guess I would just echo Dave's comments. All across the board. This prediction isn't new. This prediction's been around for 5 years at least. There have been various studies with a wide variety of outcomes. I think only, you know, we'll just track this trend and see what happens. I'd also note that, you know, green open access in some way is tied to those subscription programs. The funding flow behind green OA is actually the subscription costs. And so it will be very interesting to see how this plays out, because it could have a significant impact on the viability of green OA from my perspective. Or it could go a different direction. But I think it's one where I would be wary of seeing something that's posted on the Scholarly Kitchen blog as being somehow indicative of the future. It's been a speculation for quite a while, and the studies have had very diverse outcomes. And physics is really a great example of where kind of the both and as opposed to either or.
Well, it looks like we're ready to wrap up our time together. I would like to give a virtual round of applause to our panel for sharing some great info today. We really appreciate your time and insights. As a reminder, we have recorded today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice that will include instructions on how to access the archived version. Thanks again to all of our participants for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the session